In this episode, I talk with Dr. J.R. Miller about his book on Genesis in the Bible. He makes the case that Genesis is different from ancient Near East myths in fundamental and important ways, although there are some similarities. We touch on how modern science connects with the Bible, and he shares his views on the Big Bang Theory and evolution. So stay tuned, as they say. My name is Martin. This is the Search for Truth podcast. So, hello, Dr. Miller. Thank you for joining today.
Good to be here, Martin. Thank you for asking me. I'm glad we could get it all worked out with the shutdown of the world with Amazon services.
Yeah, we tried to do this recording last week, but it did not. Yeah, we did not end up doing it, so we're doing it now. So thanks for joining. So you've written this book called Set Apart, How Genesis Stands Alone. I'm holding it up to the camera here for those watching. And I've read it, and I thought it was fascinating. But so before we dive into it a little bit and discuss the topics of the book, I want to talk about you. So I see on the back, there's a short bio about you, and it says you've got all these degrees. You've got a BS in architectural engineering and an MDiv, a DMin. Is that a Doctor of Ministry?
Doctor of Ministry, yeah.
And a Master of Theology and a PhD in ethics, and I may have missed one or two, but that's a lot of degrees. So can you tell us a little bit about what led you to get all those degrees and kind of your background and what interests you?
Yeah, so I just have an eclectic interest. I love to learn, and a lot of times I didn't have a big plan. I just saw, here's an opportunity. I have to say, although all the degrees that I have no debt. And so that was a big thing. And so I was able to accomplish all those things and just feed my passion to learn about different things. My undergrad was in engineering, as you said. So it was just, that's where I kind of started out. Then I felt God's call to go to seminary. So I did seminary, pastored for 20 some years. And in the midst of it, found I had interest in maybe going into academia. So I had to add a couple other master's type issues. Well, first I did my DMin, actually. I take that back because I was planting and felt like I needed to do a better job at it. So I looked at some leadership issues and ended up studying a lot on elder plurality. And then when I wanted to move in academia, I realized without a PhD, that was going to be impossible, especially with the shifting landscape in education. So to kind of work that in, I had to get a different master's, emphasized in Master of Arts in Science and Religion, which is related to a lot of this stuff that we're looking at today. And then worked my way into my PhD so I could finish that. So a lot of it was just I had a goal set in mind, loved to learn, and just sort of had to do the next thing. Probably if I'd have better planned it out, I wouldn't have had to do all those degrees, but it was still a fun process.
Oh, that's awesome. So I see the book is published by Reasons to Believe. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that organization and how you're connected with it a little bit?
Yeah, well, fun fact about that. So Reasons to Believe is really the premier old earth creation organization. The book started with my Master of Arts in Science and Religion, which I did at a seminary where I was teaching, which was a young earth seminary in Southern California. And it was my master's thesis for that degree. And I had readers who were both young earth and some old earth people were readers for that. And so when I kind of eventually moved out of teaching at that place, felt like I kind of on the science side, a little more connected to the old earth side, and got involved with Reasons to Believe because that's where all the people are at who talk about that on the science and faith side. And then had this book project come up and they wanted to publish it. And so I feel pretty proud of the fact that the book itself, the content has been looked at by both young earth and old earth people, and both felt pretty great about the content. So it's sort of is some middle ground of agreement between those two camps. So that's where it came from, and sort of the RTB publishing it is a great platform for it.
Great. Yeah, I'm a little bit familiar with it. I've seen some of their content and I follow them on social media. So I do think they're an important organization in this day and age. So yeah, that's great. So what made you write this book, Set Apart? And what's the main topic for those tuning in.
Yeah, so the
And
main
yeah, go
idea
ahead.
of the book Set Apart, yeah, the main idea is just that Genesis has something different to offer than other ancient mythologies. So when I was doing my, let's see, it was my MDiv, I had my professor, my Old Testament professor, one of his degrees was in ancient Near East civilizations. And so he had a lot of his content that we did the Old Testament was focused on that. Matter of fact, my first introduction, almost forgot about this. In my undergrad at Penn State, I took one of the few random courses I got to take as my gen eds because it was a pretty focused engineering degree. But I got to take an old Earth, or yeah, old Earth, yeah, listen to me, a class in the Old Testament, but it
Mm.
was taught by a guy who was a pretty leading figure in Old Testament theology, Jewish by background, but not religiously Jewish, and not Christian either. And he taught it from a very much the perspective of the philosophy of religion side, the typical idea that they evolved over time from a polytheistic or animistic to monotheistic religious perspective. And that was his teaching on that. So then when I had at my seminary from a guy who was an ancient Near East scholar, I saw this different side of these stories. And so when I did my Master of Arts in Science and Religion, I just really wanted to dive more deeply into what are the key facets that make Genesis so different? Because I think a lot of Christians are persuaded, especially when they're in the academic world, that if they're gonna be accepted, they've got to buy the sort of assumption from the naturalistic framework that there's an evolution of Hebrew religion, that it's a crossover, it's just another ancient myth, or it doesn't tell us anything historically true. And I don't think that's right. So I wanted to kind of address that from a detailed level of, hey, how is it set apart?
Mhm. Oh, very cool. So, yeah, let's dive into the content a little bit here. So, first of all, maybe before we get into the differences, maybe just very generally, what are some similarities between Genesis and some ancient near myths? Or can you name one or two ancient near myths and like why would people say that they're similar, for example?
Well, there's a lot of elements, a lot of the names that get used, the names of places and deities and idol worship, all of these things are embroiled in an ancient Near East context. So to
Oh, yeah,
understand
sorry to interrupt.
Genesis, okay,
So what is ancient Near East actually? So what period roughly was that and where was that, I guess?
okay, so yeah, so we're talking about, if we're looking at modern context, we're talking about what would be like Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Arabian Peninsula, Middle East.
Hmm.
That's the ancient Near East period. The relevant parts that cover over this, that bridge over the time of the New Test or the Old Testament, would be the important parts of when this were written. So even in Moses' time, although the times would be a little bit older than that. So when you're talking about 2000, 3000, 4000 BC, this is still this ancient Near East period, although there's broader spectrum of time. That would be the relevant time when the stories of the Old Testament are being lived out and then being written down. And so that would still at least include that period of the ancient Near East in that region. Does that help?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. So now I have to remind me what the other question was. I forgot already.
Yeah, so can you give us one example of an ancient Near East myth? I guess there's the Enuma Elish, right? I've heard of
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah.
Many
Enuma
people may have
Elish
heard of
is
that
one of
one.
those big stories that has some crossover, and there's always these common elements. There's common themes. Actually, let me bring up one that's less commonly used, but I think a little bit easier for people who don't have to know as many details about it to get a sense of why a lot of people think that the Old Testament is myth that is born out of this ancient world of myth making.
Mm.
So there's this story called the Atrahasis epic. It's a story of human origins and a flood story as well that goes back
Hmm.
to the 17th century BC. So that's again that ancient Near East period, far older than some of the stories of, say, Abraham or when Moses is around, but it goes back. And in this story, it's really interesting because it's a polytheistic story. So there's many gods, as all other stories were outside of the Hebrew Genesis account. And it's a story of there's these greater gods and the lesser gods. And the lesser gods are forced to do this work on behalf of the greater gods. Eventually they rebel. They don't want to do the work. And so the greater gods, to put down the rebellion of these lower gods, they're called the Gigi, they come in and they kill one of these lesser gods. And the blood of this god and the spirit of this god mix with the earth, the dirt of the earth, right? The ground. And out of this is born the first humans, comes this first human out of blood and earth.
Mm.
And these humans then become the slaves to the gods. They're doing all the labor that's beneath even the lower gods. Well, eventually there's too many humans and they start to make a lot of noise and the gods can't sleep at night. So they send a bunch of plagues. Then they send a flood. And of course that mirrors in some ways the flood. So that's where this guy Atrahasis comes in. But some of the elements, when you read some of the people who do these analysis, they say, well, hey, look, here's this story of Adam, who God forms out of the dust of the earth. And then we have this story of Atrahasis, and he's the, the humans in that story, in that epic, are formed out of the dirt of the ground. And so see, they're building on the same common things. And so they've born out of the same idea. The problem with that sort of analysis is that it assumes that just because Earth is common to both, that somehow they're both mythic in their storytelling, or that because there's a flood waters in both, that therefore they're both myth making.
Mm.
That's like saying if you're telling a story about, hey, one day when I was 3 years old, the sun came up and I was raised into the clouds, and you have this fantastic 3-year-old level story about your life. And I say, hey, well, I woke up this morning to the sunrise peeking in my house, and I really needed my coffee because I'm tired. So I said, aha, your stories both have the story of a sunrise, therefore both are rooted in mythology.
Okay. Yeah.
That's the problem with a lot of these analyses, that they look at common features and assume that the underlying assumption of the worldview that in these religions is also the same. And that's where we run into problems.
Right. The similarity is sometimes only sort of superficial or like
Yeah,
secondary, like
exactly.
properties, right?
Yeah, and philosophy, yeah, be accidental properties. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So what actually makes Genesis different? You have a list of things in the
Yeah.
book. You mentioned one big one was in Genesis. They believe in only one God, right, as opposed to a whole set of gods or a universe of gods that are born and die and fight with each other and stuff like that, right? So that does seem to be like a
Exactly.
major difference, right?
Yeah. So the idea of monotheism versus polytheism is quite significant. One God versus many gods. And a lot of times, what I think I see happen in a lot of the literature, a lot of the write up, and a lot of academic people is they just sort of will say, yeah, that's a difference. But they don't really spend the time, as I do in the book, talking about why that difference is so significant towards the substance of these creation stories. So, in one sense, for the Hebrews and their worldview, that God alone is transcendent. He's distinct from his creation. He's not part of it. This is a huge difference because for the polytheistic religions, the gods are unique. They're outside of nature, but they're also in nature. So you get a lot of these stories where, like you mentioned, Enuma Elish, where the god Marduk kills Tiamat in battle. And so it's born of violence, and he rips her body in half, and half of her body becomes the earth, and half become the skies. And so you get these stories where of the gods that their body becomes the substance of the physical world. That's far different than the Genesis 1 creation story where God says he forms that was unformed and he fills that was unfilled. And he's pictured as this loving craftsman. He doesn't have to kill another God. It's a world not born in violence, but it's a God shaping and forming and filling. And there's an intimacy that's connected that also shapes the story of the fall and God's redemption. There's a consistent nature of God that comes across in those stories that are critical. So there's not the chaos involved. And the third thing I'd say about that one is also that reality itself then becomes unified. when you have these polytheistic story, reality itself is fragmented. And that's why when we get to concepts of science and understanding the world around it, those polytheistic religions didn't have this view of science that we have, because if the gods are, the world is born in chaos and fighting and battle, I just have to fight and battle my way to my own ends and my own purpose. But the Hebrew worldview shaped that there's a unified reality. There's a God who thought and spoke and structured it. Therefore, we have a way of knowing something about this God and his loving, caretaking sort of approach to creation that we can learn from this, because reality is unified in that way.
That makes sense. So another one of your points is that Genesis is special revelation, not cultic theology. Can you go into that a tiny bit?
Yeah. So
What does that
cultic
mean?
theology is a little bit of a technical term. So everybody would say cultic doesn't mean they're cults. So just to let people understand that. So cultic theology, we'd say the Hebrew cultic practices of worship. It's just a technical term that a lot of philosophers of religion will use, or people that look at ancient religious practices. So cultic just means the set of practices that are used by one set of religion. So when I'm using that terminology and talking about their sort of their cultic practices, the thing that I'm keying in on for that is that Israel has a set of worship practices that reflect this intimate relationship with God, this intimacy with God, and His creation. You could say predates the worship practices itself. In other words, the religious worship reflects reality. For these other polytheistic religions, these are stories that are used to preserve political power, and their cultic theology is ritual imitation of the cultural norms that try to shape that reality. So in other words, they have violent they go to war against another people and they conquer them. So they tell a story that justifies the need to go to war. Or they have a
Mm.
religious ritual that has to implore the gods why they need to take battle and victory. And they're emulating these stories of the battle between the gods. So for their Hebrew worldview, it would be the opposite. They're not establishing temple worship to appeal to God to give them something. They're establishing their temple worship as an act of reverence for what God has revealed about Himself through creation. So
Mm.
it's reversed in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think another one of your points is, or you use the term theo-history, which I think
Hmm.
refers
Yeah.
to theology history, or is
Theological
that
history. Yeah.
theological history, as opposed to mytho-history, which is a term. Is that a term from William Lane Craig?
Yeah.
Or okay,
Yeah. I was poking the bear a little bit with William Lane
okay.
Craig's
So tell us about
Mytho-History.
that. Yeah, those
Yeah.
two terms.
So
And
yeah, Craig's Mytho-History is his basic idea is that Genesis 1 through 11 is a mix of historical versus mythical, which doesn't necessarily mean false, depending on who you ask who's writing it. His intention is not to say it's false. It's just saying there's creative license taking or a borrowing from these ancient things, and it's a mix of what's historical. But there's no way to really tell what parts are historical, what parts are mythical, unless you're an ancient scholar and have some expertise in those areas. The average reader wouldn't be able to tell what's historical and what's mythical. I prefer the term theological history or theohistory because the idea is that I believe Genesis 1 through 11 is historical. All of it has historical roots, but it does tell a history with a theological purpose. That is, it's pointing us to God. So it's telling us about real acts of a real God in space and time. They're not symbolic acts. So when God says, let there be light, I believe God speaks and there is light. This is not symbol. The people like Adam and Eve aren't symbols who stand in the place of real humans who once existed. They are real people historically who existed, and God fashions Adam from the dust of the earth and he pulls Eve from the side of Adam. So I do think that there's a theological telling of the story, but it also is a history of cause and effect. The history of the fall is a historical cause with a moral effect. Human sin is therefore like we're responsible for that, and it's not a metaphorical story of just how humans entered into corruption, but there's a real cause and effect. And of course, that means that truth then is rooted in God's actions, not our human imagination or some cultic myth-making process of trying to understand God. That gives us confidence that when we read the scripture, it can tell us what is true and what is good in our own moral decision making. And again, on the science side, that tells us if there's a cause and effect reality in Genesis, that we can study the cause effect into the world around us, and we can know something real about the mind of the maker.
That's very interesting. Yeah, there's a lot I want to kind of get into, but
yeah.
I want to, you got a whole chapter called Creation ex Nihilo versus ex Materia, I think.
Yes.
Which chapter is that? Chapter 3?
Yeah,
chapter 3. Yeah. So for those who don't know those terms, what does that even mean? Creation ex nihilo, not ex materia, and why is that relevant here?
Well, first, it's always relevant to use Latin because that makes you sound smarter. So,
Okay.
and plus, I mean, guys, learn the Latin. The ladies at parties just love it. That's pretty much the way I was told. I don't know if that's true or not, but I like to believe that about myself. So, ex nihilo just means out of. Ex is out of, nihilo means nothing. The idea is for the Hebrew story of creation in Genesis 1, God creates by divine command. He speaks and it comes. He does not organizing chaos into order. He's not using eternal matter into something else. He's speaking all of the time, space, reality that we inhabit into existing. Ex materia means out of something. And that's again like that story I told you before, where matter, the gods existed eternally. And so the creation of the world is like Marduk taking the body of Tiamat, fashioning that into the physical world. So although the earth had a point of, where it came into being, it's made out of eternal matter of some kind, the transformed material stuff of the bodies. And actually, there's parts, this is something I don't get into in the book, but there's different words of creation used in Genesis 1. We see where Genesis 1, when God speaks everything ex nihilo into existence. But then there's parts where it says God's using a different Hebrew term to describe how God is actually shaping and fashioning. That's where we get this idea of God, the artisan. He's creating ex materia, out of something. He separates the day from the night. He separates the waters. He separates the land from the sea. And those are ex materia kind of creation, where he's taking what exists, what he's spoken into existence, and he's forming it and he's fashioning it. And this is important because it shows not just the goodness of God and his inherent goodness, because he's not creating out of violence, but the goodness of creation, the goodness of humanity, and then the goodness of work itself. These are all critical parts of this creation story, because remember, for the other ancient civilizations and their myth making, work was the stuff of the slave, right? This is why they were justified. When my people conquer your people and I enslave you, you have no inherent intrinsic goodness as a people. We were all created to be slaves. And if the gods can make slaves of the lesser gods and the lesser gods can make slaves of humans, if my God can beat up your God, then I have the moral authority to make you my slaves. So there was no moral badness to that, because humans aren't intrinsically good or bad. They just are. And they were actually made for slavery. So that's a very different worldview than we get with this Hebrew concept of ex nihilo creation and the idea of a good God making a good creation. He's doing good work, and we're to emulate that good work by doing the good deeds he created us to do.
Amazing. So I think, this is quite interesting. And I think this is where it also connects with science from my perspective. So ex nihilo creation, that really reminds me of the Big Bang Theory, right? And how scientists are saying that the universe came seemingly from nothing, or in an instant, everything was created somehow, right? So do you see that connection as well between, Genesis 1:1 and Big Bang cosmology, or
Yeah.
how do you see that?
So the history of that's a little odd in some ways because for thousands of years, Western civilization believed in the eternality of matter. It goes back to the Greek philosophers. So there was only basically the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians who would hold to the finite nature of the physical world, and so they were on the outliers. Then you get essentially the theory proposed in the 1920s through like guys like Edwin Hubble and others that this beginning point. It's not until you get into the 60s and the 70s that there's actually convincing evidence that there was a beginning point based on things like redshift, all these sort of things we can actually make observational claims to. It was interesting, but the competing theory, the steady state theory, was actually held on to by a lot of atheists because they believed even the idea, even positing the beginning, sounded too much like Genesis 1:1.
Yeah.
So even though it wasn't really posited for those reasons, there were scientific reasons that just couldn't be validated for 50 or so years. But it just sounded too much like it. So finally, in the 70s, when the consensus shifts because the evidence is in favor, then all of a sudden, a lot of atheist scientists say, well, yeah, this is exactly what it is, but it's still not going to validate the Genesis claim that there's a beginning. So I do think there's a lot interesting philosophical and sort of theological debate that happens there. I don't think Christians should look at the Big Bang, which was named actually as a pejorative. It was meant as a name to marginalize those that held it. It was meant to ridicule the theory scientifically, but then, gets accepted.
Yep.
I do think the Big Bang, although it's pretty scientifically well established, there are some challenges to it, because we don't know all the answers. There are conflicts in the way in different observations about the universe that we still haven't figured out. There's obviously a conflict between the quantum mechanics and the theories of special relativity that we can't reconcile. Both do a great job of explaining observable data, but they both fundamentally make some different assumptions about that are in conflict. So we don't know who's right yet. So we could undo Big Bang thinking, but in principle, it does point to at least a singular point of origin
Yeah.
for this material reality, which in principle does align with the Genesis 1:1 creation. I don't
Yeah.
think it
Just the fact
necessarily
that there was a
proves
beginning, right? In the
it does,
beginning.
yeah, but it points to an alignment there that I
Yeah.
think they're compatible.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me give you a quote by Arno Penzias. Do you know Arno Penzias? He's a
Yes, sounds familiar.
Nobel Prize winner in physics, and his
Oh,
quote on
okay,
this
yeah.
was, "The best data we have, scientific data, meaning best data we have, are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the first 5 books of Moses, including Genesis, right? The Psalms and the Bible as a whole, right? So, there are
Yeah,
Nobel Prize winners who are atheists, but they're Nobel Prize winners
yeah.
who believe that." That what we observe is what he would have predicted based on Genesis, right? I don't think he was a
Yeah,
Christian. I think he was a Jewish believer, but
yeah,
certainly thinks Genesis is relevant to to
yeah.
science and the universe and everything. So
Yeah,
I
there's
thought
a
that was
great book in the
interesting.
70s called God and the Cosmos, Jastrow. It
Mm,
was one of the leading astrophysicists, great guy. But I don't think, as far as I know, he died. Last I showed some video clips of him in my class in 2012. He did an interview in Danish TV. They got all these world-renowned scientists and interviewed them about their view of the world.
hmm.
And he said, in the 70s, here we go from the steady state to the Big Bang theory, and this is earth shattering, and it points to a creator, but he doesn't want to believe there's a creator, so he's just going to believe the science and the equations tell me everything, but the science and the equations tell me that there's something more outside of it, but I don't want to believe there's something out of it. And his whole struggle is to deal with this, that the science can't prove in the sense of God is there, that he's the beginner, the banger of the Big Bang, so to speak.
Right,
But it does point to that the natural world cannot explain itself, which is why you
right.
have all these ad hoc theories today of the multiple theories of the multiverse, ad infinitum, how many theories about the multiverse are there? I don't know, many, many, many. But most of those are ad hoc because they don't want to deal with the consequences of the science pointing to a beginning point.
Right.
So we have these scientists who are really much more acting philosophically than scientifically, trying to posit these things they can observe, they can't prove in any meaningful observational way, but they need them to be true because they don't want to accept the implications, the ramifications of what we know to be true.
Right. 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 Okay. Creation is contingency, not theogony. Am I saying that right?
Yeah,
What
it's
what
a big
what, what
word,
does that
right?
mean?
So contingency just means the creation is dependent solely on the will of Yahweh. It's contingent on something. Its existence is dependent on something else. It's not self-explanatory. It's not self-explain. It doesn't explain itself like we just talked about. Theogony is specifically a term where you have gods battling for power amongst themselves. And so you have these gods who are competing for who's going to have the resources and which gods are going to control what other gods and which gods are going to control which regions. So you got to remember that at this time in the ancient world, you had gods were really city-state gods. So one god ruled one area or one region. This god ruled another area, another region. So like in Egypt, for example, you had gods of the southern kingdom and you had gods of the northern kingdom. It's not till this god Ptah in the Memphite era, era uh, sort of defeats these two gods or unites these two gods is probably better to say, and then they become a unified Egypt, one nation under one pharaoh who is considered the manifestation of these great gods, right? He is a god himself, but to justify his power in uniting the kingdom, you have to have a uniting god. So but that's born in chaos in these battles. The significance of that for the Hebrew worldview, for the Genesis story, for the Christian, is that if there's only one God and one creation that's contingent solely on that one God, then creation has a single and final purpose. So monotheism gives us that arrow of time. It says there's a beginning. With a garden temple, there's a purpose that God has in store. He wants to go from a garden temple to a global temple. And Theogony is going to just say that everything is cyclical. It's repeating. There's a process and there's no ultimate meaning. So the gods are born and they die and then they come back the next day when they rise with the sun. And so life is just simply repeating the cycle of birth and death of the gods. Not a cyclical in the sense of reincarnation. That's not what the
Mm,
ancient world had. I don't want to
mm,
mislead people with that one, but
yeah.
cyclical in the sense of they're just repeating this cycle of more gods are made, more gods are killed, and humans have this just existence of life is what it is, and you're going to live and die. Might as well make the best of it you can, just like the gods do. So there's no moral guiding purpose except for getting along on your own. And again, another piece of that is the harmony of general and special revelation. Because of this, there's one God who made it, then science and theology can both tell us something true about the orderly world because it's not illusion, it's not chaos. There's something real there. And so both have something valuable to tell us about the reality we inhabit.
I agree. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that was a fascinating chapter. Um, and then you had a chapter on divine command is not theomachy. Am I saying that word
Yeah,
right?
Theomachy, I
Oh,
guess. That's
theomachy.
what
Okay.
I'd say.
Yeah, can you explain that term and just the general idea
Yes.
of that
Yeah.
one?
So again,
That
another
was also
more
interesting.
terms that are used in common literature of religious literature. So trying to bridge the formal writing that people might get with a more accessible
Hmm.
introduction to these thoughts. But Theo, as God, Theomachy is just that this idea that these are the myths that establish the hierarchy of the power among the gods. So with divine command, of course, there's no hierarchy because there are no other gods.
Hmm.
So if there's no divine hierarchy, then moral authority comes from God's command. Is in his nature too. He can tell us, do this, act in this way. His nature, which is revealed in the physical world, can tell us something about moral purpose and design. If we're made male and female, there's a purpose, there's a goodness to that because we're made in the image of this God. But it's not about establishing political order or cultic power or religious power, right? The Hebrew religion is good because our God beat up your God. That's not what's happening. And if there's no divine hierarchy, then there's no human hierarchy. And this is really critical, especially when you get to privileging of one ethnic group over another, or you get to the racism that takes hold in the late 1700s, 1800s, 1900s in the West, that distorted these, even the Genesis story for some Christians, but they had these origin stories that created human hierarchies. So for the Jew, for the Hebrew, for the Christian, we worship God as one human people, all created equal in his image, not in a hierarchy of order or value. The men aren't hierarchically greater than women. All of those
Mm.
things are done away with when we have a proper reading of Genesis and understanding that it is not a hierarchy of the gods. And all of that is lost in the ancient world that surrounded the Hebrews, and it often led them astray because they borrowed from the culture and treated people not as God had designed them to be treated.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Um, so you mentioned earlier old Earth versus young Earth, and
Mhm.
you do, yeah, you do mention in the book a few times that Genesis should be read as historical account of material origins, as a historical account of material origins. But yeah, I think as you said, you're not young Earth, right? Or would
I
you?
have
What's your perspective on that, right?
my book itself. I'm agnostic about the age of the earth,
Okay.
theologically agnostic, I should say, biblically
Okay.
agnostic. I
Okay.
do tend to think I hold to an old earth view. I think the science, I don't have a problem with the science of that. I don't have a problem with the science of old earth and believing that Adam and Eve were not evolved from lower hominids. They were specially created by God. The you know, all the old earth people that I know, Hugh Ross, Fuzz Rana, all those folks are believe in Adam and Eve were specially created by an act of God, that they didn't evolve from lower animals. That's not incompatible with old earth idea. We're just pushing back
No.
the ages of when they existed or when they came a little bit older than young earth people. That said, biblically, textually, I don't think the Bible really cares about the age of the earth. I
Hmm.
think it cares that it was created by God. I think it cares that it's historical. But when we look at the genealogy, the way the Hebrew people would have looked at the genealogies,
Mm.
they would have not been saying, "Hey, if we add up these things, this gets us to this age." That's not how they looked at time itself.
Mm.
And so we find, for example, there could be gaps in some of those things. And it's not because that doesn't make them ahistorical. There's still real people in the genealogies of Genesis. There's still real people groups, but there could be gaps. We see this reflected in the New Testament and the genealogies of Matthew and Luke, where it says there's 14 generations between these two people, 14 generations, but we know from the Old Testament there's more than 14 generations. Does that mean Matthew's a liar? Well, no, it means that he has a theological purpose for picking this specific set of 14 people that are important for his audience at that moment. But the Hebrew mind would have never thought, oh, he's lying because we know it's 84 generations. Nobody would have thought that way because it didn't matter to them, because they understood the theological purpose to these real historical events.
Mm.
So theological doesn't mean ahistorical. And I don't think that we can impose our modern sort of ideas of counting of time. AD, BC didn't even exist till 600 years. The whole concept of Anno Domini, the year of the Lord, didn't exist till 600, 700 years after Jesus' time, and then BC comes even after that. So yeah, it's just not necessary to impose that sort of Western modern scientific time scaling into the text to still value its historical truth. And so I just don't feel the need to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. So, as you know, many Christians and in the world in North America, I guess, do
Yeah.
hold a young Earth creationist view, right? And they
Yep.
really believe that's the only way to interpret the Bible. And but it does seem to me that is rather inconsistent with scientific observations and what I think it's fair
Yeah.
to say we know now about the universe. So that sometimes concerns me as a Christian who also
Yeah.
takes science seriously. So, what are your thoughts on that? To what extent, should we old Earth
Yeah.
Christians try to convince young Earth Christians that they're wrong? To what extent should we engage with them? To what
Yeah.
extent how do we communicate and talk to each other
Yeah.
and maybe overcome our differences in some way.
Yeah, I think that we should engage them in good faith.
Hmm.
My podcasting partner, I do a podcast called Raise the Roof. I've actually done some form of podcasting with my partner Leroy Hill for about a decade,
Oh, nice.
and he's a young Earth guy.
Hmm.
I have very good friends. Like I said, I study the young Earth place. I think there's some amazing young Earth scholars that are doing good work in the science area and in the hermeneutical sense of how do we read Genesis. I tend to disagree with their assessments, but they're still doing good work. The young Earth science and theology and the way they're reading this text has way come along. My take is what you tend to find is a lot of people that are critical of it engage with folks like Ken Ham.
Mm.
And I think that's the mistake is that Ken Ham represents an older young Earth kind of
Mm.
group of people that are very much willing to throw the bombs. Oh, if you reject this reading, then you are not a real Christian. And then so you're kind of tempted to speak back, well, if you reject Old Earth, you're not a real Christian. And you get those people in both those camps. I think there are many faithful, saved Christians who are young Earth folks and Old Earth
Sure.
folks. And we can engage each other with good faith. So that's the first thing I say is just engage each other with good faith and engage good science. I mean, we had Ken Ham debate Bill Nye, the science guy,
Oh,
years ago. That was so painful. I always joke that it's two people who neither understand science or the Bible, engaging in debate about things they don't understand. And I just don't like either of those camps as far as they're reflected. But in the young Earth camp, there are actually camps and divisions within that, and they don't like each other as much as some people don't like Old Earth people.
mm,
So find the people that are going to engage in good faith, and then or have these arguments, push back. The
mm,
thing that I think is in the positive for the young Earth people is that science thrives when we push it, when we're willing to question things. And like we said before, there are fundamental problems with quantum mechanics and special relativity. But one of them has to be wrong about something, about the
hmm.
fundamental nature of our time space reality. We just don't know. So if you're going to have young Earth people say, well, I question this observation or this tool for measuring time or the speed of light in one direction and two directions and what a lot of like Jason Lyle does, I'm fine with that. Let's question it. Let's hash that out. Let's do better at trying to understand those things. But until we actually answer those questions, I'm going to stick with what I think is more solidly scientific based on what we know. But as an all scientist, I got to hold loosely to what we know because if technology advances, we might find something else. So I want to be cautious and not tying my theology to something that I know could be overturned if science does advance enough. So we have to be thoughtful in the way we engage science with our theology.
That makes sense. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And just to add on to that, then, what are your I think you mentioned it briefly, but what are your thoughts on evolution? Right, that's also a sort of a hot topic, and certainly something that young Earth creationists um, would have very different views
Yeah.
on. Um, so yeah, there's a whole spectrum of views, right? And there's
Yeah.
there's theistic evolution, there's intelligent design, and I think you mentioned, your
Yeah.
views are similar to the RTB reasons to believe views, I guess. Or what would you say about it? I know you had like one sentence on page 56. Maybe I can read it.
Mhm.
I know the book. Yeah, the book is not really about evolution, but
Yeah.
it says Genesis tells us that humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, are the only creature made in the image of God. If it's true that humans did not evolve from lower hominids, but were the special creation of God, then we can build a testable theory that predicts paleoanthropological discoveries. So maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit and just share your general views on evolution. And yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be great.
Yeah. So my take on evolution is that it's a word that is often misunderstood because it's used as a placeholder for more specific scientific mechanisms
Hmm.
that could be tested or not tested. So when people use the word evolution, there's cosmic evolution, there's chemical evolution, and then within just the idea of biological evolution, there's at least four distinct meanings that we could break that down into. The
Yeah.
only ones that really
One meaning is
matter.
just change, right? Or development, right? Which can
Yeah,
happen
like
for
change
all
over
kinds of
time.
reasons,
Things
right?
evolve, change over time.
Yeah.
And so the way there are two commonly used terms, and a lot of times atheist scientists will say Christians made up these two terms. You can actually find them in secular literature: microevolution versus macroevolution. So for this audience, that's probably the simplest thing to start looking at. Micro being the small changes within species, so that fur density or color of a bear between the polar bear and the black bear. You can find creationist Christians who, hundreds of years before Darwin was around, making microevolutionary arguments that when Noah brought the animals into the ark, they would disperse. They went out of the ark and they were able to adapt to their environment. That God created them capable of adapting to different environmental circumstances, so that they could thrive in cold or warm weather. So you have these sort of micro, they didn't use that language, but micro evolutionary arguments that we use today that well predate Darwin. So Darwin traded in those micro evolutionary ideas that were common in the idea of animal breeding, right? The idea that we can make things change and humans can do that. But then he made the leap in his, which he had no evidence for, to the macro, the difference between, a lizard becomes a bat, or the big larger leaps in body plans, the jump from the early a common ancestor between, like, say, the human and the great ape, or the human and the chimpanzee, to humans. Like, how do we make that leap? Well, we don't have evidence of those macro big jump changes. It just simply doesn't exist. And it just gets less and less likely that those things do exist. So the more we find out about the human genome, for example, the less likely it is that we're going to make that connection, because it just doesn't pan out in the end. So in that sense, both young Earth and old Earth creationists agree that humans didn't evolve from lower hominids, and that the Bible provides the best explanation that is compatible with the science that we have, that humans made a we can look at historically the idea of these large body plans just popping into existence in the archaeological record. So we can say that, yes, these things came into existence because God did some creative act. And that's not a case of God of the gaps. That's just saying that science points to this as a reasonable explanation for those evidences.
Well, there are Christians who fully embrace kind of the evolution.
You're breaking up
right?
just a little bit.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So there are Christians who believe in evolution, for lack of a better term, right? There's there's Francis Collins, right? For example, I read his book called I think it's called The Language of God, and I think you mentioned mapping the human genome, right? I think he was involved in the Human Genome Project a couple decades ago. And so he's a committed Christian. I think he became a Christian after reading Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and he's also a scientist working on the human genome. And he does not see a contradiction between evolution, and his Christian faith. So there's that perspective as well, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead. I don't know if you have comment on that. Or...
Yeah, I would. So I don't think somebody holding to a theistic evolutionary perspective, and there are different ways of defining that, would in principle mean that they're not saved. I mean, our salvation is by grace alone, through the shed blood of Jesus Christ on the cross, and he came to die for my sins as well as my bad theology or my bad science. Thanks be to God that his greatness and his goodness is greater than my mental limitations, and whatever those might be, or my sin limitations. So I don't make that judgment on that. I do say, though, however, that, and the argument I made in my PhD was essentially that the farther we move away from the argument of special creation, Adam and Eve made directly in the image of God, towards the various spectrum of theistic evolution, towards creationary evolutionary positions. And there's a large spectrum of views on that, of how God could have intervened or not intervened, whatever it is. It goes the whole way actually to pantheism, actually technically panentheism. There's a whole spate of Christian theistic evolutionists who are actually pantheists in their view that God is actually a part of the natural world, yet they call
Mm.
themselves Christians. So people have to be very careful of who they're reading in those realms.
Yeah.
But the farther we get away, my point is, the more we compromise the our theology of Imago Dei, the image of God, and make it more difficult to defend things like, say, for example, the equality of men and women, or especially my thesis was focused on the concept of race, and so human hierarchies. The more the When we move away from the biblical teaching of Adam and Eve created de novo as a special creation in the image of God, not evolved from lower hominids, the more we move away from that, the more we compromise our moral arguments. We can still make them, they just become less coherent arguments. And so the most coherent argument against things like racism would be to embrace that historic Christian teaching. So I do think there is compromise. I think there is, we lose moral high ground, so to speak, because it leaves room for people. We can prefer not to believe those things, or we can create ad hoc theological solutions to those problems. But I do think rejecting the historic Christian teaching on this opens us up to a lot of challenges that are unnecessary.
Makes sense. Yeah. So are you familiar with Jordan Peterson and his work and his lectures? I'm just curious because he likes to talk about Genesis in a very different kind of way, but just curious to know if you're familiar with his work and have heard him lecture.
Yeah. So if I heard you right, still breaking up a little bit. So if I heard you right, you're talking about Jordan Peterson, right?
Yep.
And his. So I've not spent a lot of time with Jordan Peterson. I mean, I've heard a lot of some of his lectures. I know he gets a lot of view. He did that Genesis thing for the Daily Wire stuff, and he's got the whole series. And so my take on Peterson, he takes this sort of approach to anthropology popularized by a guy named Franz Boas. And I just did a podcast that dealt with Franz Boas and some of the early anthropological things. Margaret Mead was a popularizer of this. His view of religion is an expression of anthropology. In other words, he would say that Genesis and Christianity all we're doing is putting God language to human desires and likes and wills. So he takes a approach, if people want to literally look up like more of a Carl Jung view, that religion is a vital expression of the human psyche. So his interpretation of all this is just that we're expressing some psychological desire or need when we use the words like God and creation in Genesis. So all that to say, his understanding of Genesis, of Jesus, is very much, out of line with Christian. I honestly just don't see any value in it. If you want to know what Carl Jung or, Margaret Mead or anthropologists who would deny God's existence believe about that, he wants to say there's a value to Christianity, but not because it's true, but because it tells us it's pragmatically useful for our intellectual health or our psychological health. But that's not at all what the Christian argument is. So, he's friendly to us, but he's a friendly person who thinks we do believe something that is a delusion. So I don't know that I really need his view on much of any of that. It's just, I don't need it. I mean, it's interesting, but I have a value for it.
Well, he's certainly popular, whatever that means. He gets millions of views on YouTube, and people seem to be interested in Genesis through him in some way. Maybe they don't read Genesis in the right way, but he certainly gets people excited about Genesis, which I find interesting. And he seems to think the stories are important, right?
It's great that he's getting people engaged. I'm just being blunt about the value of it isn't really there. If you really are interested, go to actual Christians he's like the guy I studied with when I'm an undergrad who taught Old Testament but didn't believe a word of it was true. It was interesting. It was a great class, but if I really wanted to discover the truth of it, I need to go to people who believe it, who actually have tested it, who have evidences and have arguments for why they believe what they believe.
So what resources would you recommend then for people interested in understanding Genesis more deeply and how it connects with modern science as well? Do you have any good books or podcasts or lectures that you would recommend to my listeners? Yeah.
So definitely I would recommend anything from Reasons to Believe. Obviously, they've got a lot of popular level stuff, accessible to lay people stuff on their website. And so that's a great place because it is accessible. I've got some science stuff on mine. Mostly I'm dealing with the differences of my book related to, say, how Bill Craig, some theistic evolutionists, William Lane Craig or Joshua Swamidass. I do a lot more work in that area. So people can find that at morethancake.org. A lot of my articles, some of them are a little more technical than others because I'm trying to still establish sort of an academic premise for what I'm doing before I can get to the popular level stuff. So some of those are a little more heady than others, but there's a lot of work to be done in that. So that sort of puts me in that camp. For a book, I would recommend John Oswalt's book, The Bible Among Myths, Bible Among the Myths. John Oswalt used to be the president for Asbury Theological Seminary. Brilliant guy, smart guy. He actually was the reader for my master's thesis, which was an amazing get to get his insight on my idea. So he was a reader. This book that we're talking about, he's gone through that. He has some really good stuff in his book that's great. And so I would point people there if they're really interested in understanding Genesis and the idea of what the word myth means and how it relates to these actual stories and understanding the different views and these different. My book's a far shorter intro than John's, so I would actually say mine's more of an intro idea. Then go to John's as sort of like to go a little bit deeper into some other, a little more. It's a longer read, but still very accessible, very good. Those are where I would say to start.
So your website is morethancake.org, is that right?
That's right.
And I was curious, where does that name come from? That's a cool name for a website.
Yeah, so it comes from the fact that, one, I didn't want to put a website after my name. The name Joe Miller, Joseph Miller, J.R. Miller, you try to search that on the internet, it's impossible to find me. It's such a common name. So I needed something that could be searchable, would be the first thing. And so I came up with this one. When I came up with it years ago, the idea was I was more heavily involved in church ministry. And a lot of the sermons I saw, a lot of the churches I saw were preaching messages that weren't really rooted in the solid teaching of Scripture. A lot of the 5 happy hops to a better life kind of messages. And so I was at that time reading about the French Revolution period, and you get to Marie Antoinette and the famous phrase that she probably never said, but the people were starving. They didn't have enough stuff to make bread, which was their staple of their diet. So she said, let them eat cake. In theory, whether, again, she may not have said it, but the idea was give them this confection that's a sugary treat that can fill their little tummies but has no nutritional value. And I felt like that's a lot what we get in our churches is it's stuff that is palatable. We enjoy it, but it's actually not solid food of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So the idea, I was doing a lot more theological writing at that point. I still do a lot, but the idea was I wanted to give people more than cake when it came to the Word of God.
Good name. Well, thank you, sir. And to all those listening and watching, thank you for your attention. All the info related to this podcast can be found on searchfortruth.com. So thank you and hope to see you next time.